Please join me in welcoming back director James Ponsoldt. And Heather Houser from University of Texas. Welcome to join me. Congratulations on the film, James.
Oh, thank you.
It is such a special movie. I know that David Foster Wallace was a hero of yours, and you'd read a lot of his work before taking this on, but this lens seems particularly important for you to have it through David Lipsky's memoir and then through Donna Margulies' script. And can you talk about how that was special? And it wasn't really just about following David's story, but Wallace's story, but Lipsky's as well.
Yeah. I first became aware of David Foster Wallace in the mid-90s. I grew up in Athens, Georgia, and I wrote for an alt weekly there while I was in high school. I'd interview bands, review concerts, and everyone that wrote for that alt weekly, they were grad students or in local bands, they were older, and they were really into Wallace's essays that were coming out at that point, and he just seemed like the smartest, funniest, coolest writer out there, and it was being sort of mirrored to me through these people who seemed really cool and older, and everything just seemed very intimidating to me about him, because nobody that I was going to high school was reading David Foster Wallace. And I started college in the fall of '97, which is the year after Infinite Jest came out, and I was an English major, and everybody was reading it or claiming to read it or had a copy. I was going through a pretty tough time, and I bought a copy and I just read it and said no to a lot of things and a lot of relationships, but I was pretty faithful to that book for about 4 or 5 months. And it was, for that year of my life, probably the most rewarding and complicated relationship I had. And that's most of what I remember freshman year in college is reading that book. And a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again came out that year as well, and read those essays. And I suddenly felt like between that and discovering Walker Percy that I had found people who could write the way that I think thought, or at least aspired to. There's something very aspirational in Wallace's ability to articulate the feelings that I had and the experiences that I was having at the time. And I just got really obsessed with his writing and read everything I could get my hands on. Even had some of his writing read at my wedding. And then, flash forward to a couple of years ago, and my former playwriting professor from college, Donald Margulies, reached out and just said, "Hey James, I don't know if you're a David Foster Wallace fan, or if you've read this book by David Lipsky, although of course it ended up becoming Yourself, which I had read right after it came out in 2010. He said, I've actually adapted it for anonymous content, and it's coming your way, and hope you like it." And I was just terrified. It sat in my inbox for a bit, just because Wallace meant so much to me, and Donald's an amazing writer. I mean, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, and I was afraid that he would have written something beautiful, and he did. And then that's sort of how it sort of came to me initially. And also what had struck me though when I read Lipsky's book, I hadn't read it years before thinking that was going to be a movie. I read it because it was about David Foster Wallace, and I'd heard it was great. It was a New York Times bestseller. People really, really loved it, and it was Wallace in his own, in the sort of the wake of the release of Infinite Jest. Infinite Jest had been out for about 2 weeks, I think. He was at the end of the press tour, and talking about the things that were consuming him and his recognition that his life was about to change, and that he'd spent, years from 91 to 95 basically obsessing over that book when he wasn't teaching, and that now he had to figure out what was next. And it's also filtered through David Lipsky's memory. Because it's David Lipsky in 2008, 2009 listening to those tapes and sort of having a recognition that something's gone. Someone is gone. Even it's an earlier version of himself, and I think with a sense of real grief and regret at how he spent the brief time he had with Wallace, that he misspent that time perhaps. It's a really emotional book. So.
And I think that character of Lipsky, I wonder, how much we identify with him because we're going along to meet one of our literary heroes in the film. And I have a lot of questions about how you were taking the source material, but also your background and knowledge of Wallace, and both how you worked with both actors to construct those characters, particularly with Jason Segel, and how were you filling in the holes? Because you've got the Wallace in your head from reading since you were in high school, and then you're coming into David's version of him.
Yeah, I think what I really loved, I everyone that worked on this film, I think, has a pretty fierce aversion to traditional biopics. You know, the sort of stung by a bee at age 6, predicting future success or failure 40 years down the line, and, you know, deathbed confessions. Like, they're inherently reductive. 2 hours is just not enough time to tell a life. But David Lipsky's book is, by definition, just a very subjective accounting from his point of view of how he was affected by Wallace. It makes no bones about that. I mean, there's a great biography by D.T. Max about Wallace. You know, it was interesting. It was an interesting mix. I mean, most of the people who worked on the film were big Wallace fans. Not all. I mean, initially, like Donald Margulies would have been, I mean, he's slightly older than Wallace would be if he were alive. And so he was aware of Wallace, wasn't really exactly a contemporary, and he was aware of him, but he sort of approached it as an agnostic, which I think was a really, like, the book came to him from anonymous content. They said, hey, this is this book, it's a bestseller, do you think it's a play, do you think it's a movie? He was the first one to read it and say, oh, this is absolutely a film, and it's a road film. You know, it's like the Wim Wenders film to the 70s, which is a frame of reference for me. Like, I mean, California Split with Nail and I, those films are real tonal frames of reference for us. A.V. Kaufman, our casting director, who I've worked with repeatedly, you know, she cast for Ang Lee and Spielberg. She was the one that cast Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln 2 years before this. She was someone who was aware of David Foster Wallace, but not obsessed. She hadn't watched all the interviews online, so she didn't bring any baggage or any bias, really. She just, when you show her a Charlie Rose interview from 1997, she can just watch him in the company of a great journalist, you know, interviewing him and just sort of talk about what she sees and actors that sort of come to mind. So it was really great to have a team of people that had a lot of love and empathy, and some that were just approaching it as, what's the DNA of this man that we see that you could film?
I think it's really interesting that you said Donald was agnostic coming to Wallace, because there's so many themes from his writing that come through that almost suggests that his psychology and his literary preoccupations were one and the same. And I was wondering, Heather, if you could talk a little bit about, you've done a great deal of scholarship on Wallace, you have a chapter about him in your book, and you can tell us the name of your book, because I'll probably misstate it, but can you talk a little bit about those themes that you see echoing in the movie?
Well, the book is Eco-Sickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction. Many of you don't know, though some of my students are here, I teach a class just on David Foster Wallace, so for 15 weeks we live in Wallace, and some of them are agnostic and some are hostile, and some come in as obsessives. So yeah, it's interesting to see that people come to him or resist him and then come to him, and it's a really gratifying experience. But yeah, one of the things that definitely comes through here is how people who read something like Infinite Jest feel like they know Wallace, which is, I think, probably as a writer, really amazing and very creepy. And you know that you're more than your book, and you know that you're more than your persona, and yet that's also something you want from your readers, to feel like they get inside. Well, that's, you know, Wallace talks about what fiction can do is like give us access to other consciousnesses. So it's like, that is his project. But what you see, I think, coming out here, the obsession with image definitely comes through in his literary and film and TV preoccupations. I thought it was very strategic. You know, you have the copy of Don DeLillo's Americana on the coffee table, and Don DeLillo was like really one of the writers about our image culture in the 1980s and 1970s and up till today. And so, I mean, not to say all of this comes from Wallace's reading, but that question of what does it mean that our entire lives are suffused with these images and all we sometimes see is ourselves? What does that do to us? And then he has this very, you know, the philosopher side, where he's reading people like Wittgenstein who are thinking about, do we get access to other minds? Are we only inside our own minds all of the time? And someone that's smart, you know, he's living inside of his own brain all the time, but wanting to reach out and thinking that's possible, but wondering how to make that happen. So you can see it, I mean, that the dialogue is also very much in his fiction, and then that is always in conversation with these thinkers that he's reading.
Wonderful. And James, in the film, it's so difficult. You reference these films from the 70s, like California Split, which is also a very talky and wonderful movie about these two guys. And this movie has this great visual composition that carries us through in spite of the fact that we're really just watching a conversation. Can you talk about what was your visual approach and how you worked with your editor to create that rhythm that makes it infinitely watchable, even though it's this ongoing conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The first things that came to me when I read the script, there were two pieces of music and one film that I hadn't mentioned. The pieces of music were the Brian Eno song "Big Ship," which plays at the end, New Orleans Instrumental No. 1, the REM song that plays at the beginning, and "Don't Look Back," the Dia Pennebaker documentary, was something that I just couldn't get out of my head. It popped into my mind, and Pennebaker meant a lot to me as one of my teachers in college. And that film, I mean, you know, that sense, it's a once-in-a-lifetime film of just, at that point in Dylan's life, I mean, he was all of, maybe 24, 25, and the world was calling him a prophet and a god, and he thought it was a bunch of bullshit, you know, and he was kind of a dick to a lot of people and totally, like, lied, I mean, a lot about himself, but there's such a sense of surrogacy with the camera. Like, you feel like you are, oh my God, I'm in the center of the cultural universe right now. It's a black hole sucking in towards Bob Dylan, whether he wants it or not. And I want to be as close to that as possible. That's how I, as a filmgoer, feel when I watch that film. And I was like, that's kind of what this should feel like to some degree. It's certainly what it feels like to David Lipsky. And, you know, myself and the cinematographer I worked with, it's a Swedish cinematographer named Jakob Iri, who works with Joachim Trier. So they shot Reprise and Oslo August 31st and Louder Than Bombs, which is coming out. He's shot Snow before, as a Scandinavian. But we talked, I mean, endlessly I just focused on the subjectivity of it, which is, this is David Lipsky's story, this is his point of view, this is his experience, this is his version of David Foster Wallace, nothing else matters to that degree, you know? I mean, we did our research, but Lipsky is a first-rate journalist. He was a first-rate, it's not Almost Famous, where it's a sort of fawning teenager and a rock and roll star. David Lipsky at age 30 had just had a novel that was a very well-reviewed novel, a collection of short stories that were mostly published in The New Yorker, and he was writing for Rolling Stone. If David Foster Wallace didn't exist, he would have been one of the most successful young writers in America. So you know what I mean? But it's a big shadow that you're in when you're the guy that just wrote a book that sort of changes literature to some degree. But everything was from Lipsky's point of view. So the camera, everything, that sort of was a guiding principle. When we meet Wallace, I mean, there's the rush of memory at the beginning, is inherently subjective, and then you're sort of seeing Wallace from his point of view. You're seeing him through his eyes, across the room, out of focus. Eventually it becomes more of an even two-hander. That's sort of how it is initially. And then the other collaborators I had, I mean, there were so many, but like Jerry Sullivan, our production designer, who's the art director for Wes Anderson, and then did Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. Like, there was just a lovely specificity and great collaboration between him and Jakob. And what we talked about a lot was that a lot of times in films that I've seen, especially American independent films that take place in winter, they use winter as a sort of cheap and easy metaphor for like existential despair or nihilism or something, which is not the way I relate to winter. Winter's exotic to me. I'm from Georgia. We're in Texas. And so the films that we talked about, the snowy films, you know, we talked about Dr. Zhivago, you know, White Christmas, Fanny and Alexander, and we watched actually some Wong Kar-wai films too, and actually talking about films that actually have warmth, as how much warmth can we introduce into this film that inherently, because it's the Midwest and winter, are gonna have a lot of white and gray and brown. So that kitchen, I mean, there's pale greens, pale yellows. We wanted it to be a film that you like living in, as opposed to something that just objectifies these guys and talks about alienation, because it's not. This is an unrequited love story, I think. I think that's what it is for David Lipsky.
It reflects to me his comfort with the Midwest, and that is a place that he has so much love and intimacy with.
I mean, for Wallace, who's born in upstate New York, but then, yeah, I mean, it was Urbana, about an hour away from Bloomington, Normal, where this takes place. And that was where the bulk of his creative life was. I mean, California for the last handful of years of his life. But there was I think for Lipsky there may have been something exotic or quaint maybe about it. Not for Wallace. You know, there was nothing in quotes about 7-Elevens and diners and malls for him. That was what he knew. I mean, for me, that's the same thing. I mean, it's something that has a lot of nostalgia and emotion. That was the stuff of his consciousness, I think. I mean, the Midwest is arguably the or one of the main characters of the film.
And we also are in a great Wallace destination here in Austin because of our wonderful collection at the Harry Ransom Center. And Heather, you've taught those papers, and I'm wondering if you can tell people about what's at the Harry Ransom Center and how you use it.
Yeah, so it's amazing, and it is, I was telling Holly earlier, the Ransom Center gets inundated with people during South by and things like that, because all these Wallace fans are coming through, and it is open to everyone. So if you're one of these fanboys or fangirls of Wallace or DeLillo or any number of other writers and photographers, filmmakers, all sorts of things, anyone can go. And they have, it's one of the reasons it's an amazing collection is because Wallace was an avid letter writer, as you know is indicated here. So he would write to people like DeLillo, and DeLillo's collection is also there. So you can actually see both sides of the conversation, which is pretty amazing and rare. And so there are things like letters, there are early drafts, both handwritten and typewritten, of Infinite Jest, and basically anything that Wallace kept is available at the Ransom Center. So that includes notebooks for The Pale King, the posthumously published novel, incomplete novel. He kept these notebooks of phrases. So he's from the Midwest, right? But you don't always know where you are or where you're from until someone calls out, like, you say things funny. And so he would keep these notebooks of just phrases that he knew were from his background that he wanted to incorporate in that last novel and other writings that are set in this place. So just all of these, and like little ephemera, postcards, things like that. But also really fun is his entire library is at the Ransom Center. So you can look at his copy of this is one of the things I show, his copy of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is just filled, like he reread, and he would often write notes when he reread the books in different colors. So there's sort of like this little legacy of how many times he read the book. And it's just filled with notes, and he loved words. If you've read anything by him, you know one of the reasons his writing is alienating for some people is he would keep these ongoing running lists of words that were just weird and like arcane, and no one uses them, and he would make sure he used them. And so you can go through his library and look at his relationship with other literary figures, but also we were talking earlier, like he loved to read self-help books. So there's like this collection of his self-help books and his philosophy collection. So that's a real treasure, especially if you're, one of the things I use the collection for with students is to think about his reading process and his writing process, you know, so how is he's a writer because he's a reader, and so you get to see that relationship through that archive, which is very, very cool. So yeah,
we're so lucky to have it here. Are there any questions for James or Heather? There's one, third row from the back. Sir with the beard.
In casting Jason Segel and Eisenberg, did you have them hang out before shooting to get to know each other? Did you keep them apart if they were foreign? Did you have them dive deep into their characters? What was that process like?
So the question about casting these guys and how you rehearsed them and how you developed that dynamic, whether they were introduced and talked before you had them on set.
They had actually never, before this movie, they'd never worked together, and they'd never met before, strangely, which was weird to me because I always assume famous actors all sort of hang out at a club somewhere. They don't. I did not have them work together a lot. If they had, like Smash, this movie I made a few years ago, it was a husband and wife, and I did have them spend a lot of time together to sort of create that sense of history. In this case, because they were two strangers to each other, I mean, they met before we shot, and we hung out a little bit, and they, it was clear that they liked each other, and it wasn't going to be a disaster in that way. But I worked with them individually, and then they did their own individual work. Jesse spent time with David Lipsky, and sort of prepared his role. We spent a lot of time together talking about that character and his intentions, his wants, his needs, his secrets, his goals. And then with Jason, and both of them, after I sort of came on board, I asked David Lipsky if he would give me all of the tapes. Which he did, and I gave them to the actors, which I think was sort of we saw it as sort of a blessing and a curse. It was something where we could hear the vast majority of what was actually said. I mean, 75% of this was actual conversation that they had that was in David Lipsky's book. But we also didn't want to do impersonations, like we didn't want to do a Rich Little Saturday Night Live thing. These guys, we wanted to capture their essence. So Jason, the biggest thing for Jason was reading Infinite Jest. He did listen to the tapes. He did work with a dialect coach. We did talk about the script a lot. I introduced him to someone who was very close to Wallace at this time, who could sort of fill in the blanks to some degree. Like we could hear David Lipsky saying, "Well, you look good in your author's photo. Do you think that helps you sell books?" And we could sort of turn around and say, well, when Lipsky is flattering him in some sincere way or some attempt to, get him to reveal something, would he have bought into that? Was he vain? Was he the opposite of vain? Things like that. It was several months with both of them individually, and I generally talked to them separately. I really didn't want them to ever know what the other person was going for, because this isn't a portrait of two guys who are great friends. It's a portrait of two guys who both wrote fiction and also wrote profiles, and they had their own goals. In some way, they may have been performing for each other the entire time, which was sort of part of what drew me to it.
Is there another question in the center? Yes, ma'am.
So you did a lot of filming in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was curious as to why you chose, or whoever chose that location, as to why, and what were the likes and dislikes in filming in such a city that is somewhat growing, but still somewhat insular in itself.
Okay, specific question about Grand Rapids, Michigan. What was it like shooting there? And can you talk about making that choice?
Are you from Grand Rapids? Yeah, it was interesting. We had a blast, first and foremost. It was, the actual story, like in a very literal way, non-film reality, would have been Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, Chicago, Minneapolis, New York. We did shoot Minneapolis, we did shoot New York. We couldn't go to all of those cities because we were a low-budget independent film. What Grand Rapids offered us was, when you're within the city center, you could kind of fake for Minneapolis or Chicago if you don't step back too far. And then within 10, 15 minutes of it, you could put yourself in semi-rural areas that were believably Bloomington Normal. There was that, and we also needed weather. Maybe it's just global warming, whatever, but like we were not sure that even if we could have shot in the exact town, that we would have had the snow that the story required by going further north. We had that. We had a great Detroit crew. There's that as well. There's a fantastic crew base. So that's the different reasons. And it was actually fantastic to shoot there. I love to talk about Grand Rapids. I grew to really love the city.
Yes, over here in the back.
My question is about, I guess, the Wallace fandom. This film seems to have provoked some anxiety already in terms of whether it's product or the cult.
That was so Wallace appropriate. Sorry, I'm sorry. Continue your question.
On the one hand, there seems to be some anxiety about whether this satisfies kind of the desire to make Wallace a celebrity and the sort of cult of David Foster Wallace. And on the other hand, there seems to be an anxiety about bringing people to Wallace who haven't read his work before. And that seems like a kind of two-horn dilemma. And I'm wondering how you think about that, and how you think about your audience and your responsibility to people who knew him, and to his fans, and to people who don't know his work yet.
So, question is about making a biographical film of somebody who holds a lot of weight for a lot of people, and there has been some controversy about that. And can you talk about what it's like to make it something about a real person and having to deal with what that means?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In making the film, I think what started was, a group of people who were, had been deeply inspired by David Foster Wallace's writing. That's what brought us to it. And David Lipsky's book and Donald Margulies' adaptation of that book, David Lipsky telling his story of his time with Wallace. So there was that, which felt incredibly focused. Wasn't Cradle to the Grave. There's no God's eye point of view. It is the David Foster Wallace that David Lipsky encountered, what he perceived. So it's something very focused. And David Lipsky's book, which came out in 2010, was an acclaimed book. It was a bestseller, it was well reviewed, it was written with the support of a lot of David Foster Wallace's family. They're thanked prominently in the acknowledgments. So as far as it sort of having its own life, it had it by the time the film started. And then, this was new for me as far as telling a story about real people. And it's thrilling, in a way, because what I've realized in sort of screening the movie, we premiered it at Sundance, it's played a lot since then. I've now talked to tons of people who knew Wallace, that have seen the movie, people that knew him very, very well, people that met him in a bookstore, people that worked with him briefly on an article, everything under the sun. I've talked to people who knew him and don't want to see the movie for whatever reason. I think it's all totally valid. The people that have seen it, that I've spoken to, that knew Wallace well, have been really moved by it. Whether that's Kimberly Harris and the Harris family who were named in the credits, who were the family at Illinois State. They were the ones that hired David Foster Wallace. Kimberly lived with Wallace at that point. They were really great advisors. Or whether it was Michael Silverblatt from Bookworm. We did a screening a few weeks ago, and he grew to know Wallace very well, had him on a show 5 times together. And what I've realized is that Wallace is so many things to so many people, and everyone has a very different take on him. My sense, and I think this is something also that's been very navel-gazing for me, because I feel, obviously I'm reading everything online about this, and then I step back and I'm like, oh yeah, actually every movie ever, and there's lots of movies about real people, they always deal with this, and it's incredibly complicated. But as far as, what I think would be a real success for the film would be simply if it's clear that we did this with our intentions were to respect David Foster Wallace, to see him as a complicated human, to do it with a sense of empathy and admiration, and if we can draw new people to his writing and get people to read his books, which, it's funny, we were checking Amazon, I wish I could check local book sales, but what they were a month before the movie came out of Infinite Jest versus now, it's through the roof, which is really thrilling to me. So whether someone has read all of his writings, or just heard This Is Water on YouTube, whatever their point of entry, I don't judge it. The same mind that gave birth to This Is Water, he was writing The Pale King at that point. It's the same guy, so I think whatever gets people reading, whatever gets people engaging with his ideas is great, and I take a sense of comfort in the notion that, what he's talking about here is what he really cared about. He's discussing the themes, the obsessions, all the ideas of Infinite Jest. Thank you.
Yes, sorry.
So, of course, a lot of people are saying this is a very transformative role for Jason Segel, and I was wondering, going into it, what about Jason Segel seemed right to the part for you? And then, was there anything about the performance in the end that surprised you?
Great. So talk about casting Jason Segel, seeing Wallace in him for this role, and what surprised you about his performance?
Yeah, the way it started, when I first sat down with the producers, the guys at Anonymous Content, we just started talking about movies and actors that we loved. It was just a nerdy sort of big circle jerk of excitement over, we're making something about someone we love, and who are people that would be appropriate for this? And most of us had huge blind spots because we were big fans of Wallace, and we'd seen every single clip you could find on YouTube of him and had read a ton of his writing. So very little objectivity in that regard. Once we opened it up to A.V. Kaufman, our casting director, it was really interesting what she saw in watching him with Charlie Rose, 1 year after this. It's an amazing interview if you haven't seen it. At a certain point, Charlie Rose doesn't even want to talk to him about his writing. He's just asks him to talk about movies that are in the theater at that time. Will you talk about Shine? And David Foster was okay, are you kidding? You really want me to? And then he just gives a perfectly articulated 3-pronged thesis, Pauline Kael level evisceration of the movie. And then he doubles back and apologizes, I'm so sorry. And it's he strikes you as someone who's simultaneously used to being the smartest person in the room and was also raised by people with very good manners, which is an interesting combination. What we realize, of course, is if you're making a movie about someone that a general audience, hasn't maybe read a lot about or read much, what they know maybe is that he wrote a large and complicated book and died tragically, they probably assume that he was self-serious or sad all the time. When you watch footage of him, it's very clear what we all know, everyone who's a fan of his, he was one of the funniest writers of his generation. He was so quick, he was so sharp, he was so alive. And also on a personal level, I just thought a lot of, the genre tropes, I think, of the quote-unquote tortured artist. Most depictions I hate, and the people that have been really close to me that have wrestled with depression and addiction and committed suicide, they don't fit the bill of most things that I've seen in films. If you casually met most of them, they're some of the most radiant, alive people you would ever hope to meet. And that was what interested us about this specific moment in time for Wallace. At this time, he had worked really hard on a book, and the world didn't deny it, it affirmed it. He was dealing with his mental health in a good way, he was sober, he was teaching. This was not the high or the low lows, the real histrionics of most biopics about artists. We talked about every actor, but we also when we arrived at Jason's name, I had always been a fan since Freaks and Geeks, which also I saw in college. It actually really affected me. I think it's maybe the most beautifully cast teen ensemble I've ever seen. My So-Called Life, Dazed and Confused, Last Picture Show, American Graffiti, Fast on Ridgemont High. And Jake, for all the actors that came out of it, he's the emotional anchor of it. He's honest, he has sad eyes, he's someone that you lean into and want to spend time with. The way I feel when I watch early performances from like Jimmy Stewart or Tom Hanks or Jack Lemmon. And then when he was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall, he wrote that role. He's a writer. Like when he was in the Muppets movie, which I'm gonna show to my kid when he's like old enough, like Jason was the one that personally revived that franchise and wrote that script. And he's writing the Legos sequel, and he's got his second children's book coming out. He's a writer. And there's something for all the writers in the room that you know that you can't fake. The process of actually trying to get the ideas that are in your head that you think are brilliant onto a page and failing 99% of the time, feeling inept and small and impotent to actually do anything, and then submitting it to the scrutiny of other people and letting them eviscerate it, and then doing it again and again if you're lucky enough to get it out there, having critics eviscerate it. Like, you have to be a real masochist. Most people quit. Most people don't finish their script, don't finish their book, and those that do, they're addicted to it and they have to do it. And it's a specific temperament that Jason Segel knows really well. So does Jesse Eisenberg, he's also a writer. So it was that and meeting with Jason and just realizing how complicated he is. He only recently, in the past couple of weeks on the Mark Maron thing, started talking about being sober, which is something he'd been private about until then. And he's just thoughtful and really smart, and not at all like the guy he played on TV.
Good reason. Okay,
Thank
we
you.
have time for a couple more. So I'm sorry if we don't get to you, but we'll do our best. Yes, ma'am, in back.
I was wondering if you could talk through how you dealt with this undertone of death, and of some of the specific scenes that the dialogue deals with that more specifically.
Okay, so dealing with death in this film, it's a theme. It's something that's on the mind of the viewer from the very beginning. How did you go into it with that, knowing it was going to be a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, it's there. We kind of went out of our way to get it out of the way early, you know what I mean? It's something that I think the audience brings their own awareness into it, and it is a memory story in the way that, in a Proustian Madeline sense, it is the news of someone's death that it brings that rush of memories for David Lipsky. So it's everywhere, and honestly, it's everywhere in Wallace's writing, consistently, whether it's Infinite Jest, whether it's, I don't know, what your favorite Good Old Neon, something like that, which to me is probably the most personal short, which is in Oblivion, the most personal short story he wrote. It was a constant. I mean, I think he was working very hard, and it's one of the revelations, maybe you could speak about this better than I could, but one of the real revelations of all those self-help books that he had, I don't think it was ironic that he possessed all those books. I think he was curious about the language of self-help, probably as someone who just consumed culture, but I think he was working really hard to stay alive. There's something that people say about people that have committed suicide, which is that they're not trying to hurt themselves, they're killing themselves to end the pain. And so I think it was something that was consistent through his work, but hopefully by focusing on this moment in time, which was a real success for him, he had a fancy Rolling Stone journalist fly all the way out just to spend time with him, and he wanted it. I mean, he had complicated feelings about it, but I think this was a really bright moment in his life.
Okay, last question. I'm sorry, and I saw yours, so I'm gonna take yours, Mickey. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a comment?
Oh, no.
Okay.
The self-help books, I think you're exactly right, finding, and there's the quote in the film, finding ways to live, but also just if you've read Infinite Jest and also other things, the power of cliche, we dismiss self-help as this sort of just this language that you're supposed to buy into without really thinking about it, and it's sort of marketed to you, and there's something false about it, but finding the truth in these things that seem to be empty, but they're true, and they circulate for a reason.
And I think, even to add to that, I think when Wallace passed away in 2008, I think it was incredibly devastating for so many of his fans, not because the world lost a great writer, but specifically because he'd given articulation so much, in a way, the only other writer I can think of maybe is William Styron, to the quality of wrestling with depression. He had written about it so much that it could delude a reader to believe, oh, he understands it, he can articulate it, he's conquered it. But it's not that simple, it's a disease. And I think that was it, because it leaves you feeling, well, if he could articulate himself as well as he did about it, and he still died, where does that leave the rest of us who are wrestling with the same demons?
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm actually wondering how you feel like you grew as a director making this film, like what kind of challenges you encountered and how you overcame them.
Can you talk about your personal growth as a director making this film? What did you learn and what challenged you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question that I probably wouldn't have a really, I don't know that I have the objectivity to answer that quite yet. I mean, probably if we check in 2 years, I'll probably have a better answer. But, it changed for me, like when I would get really excited about a film, making a film is 2 or 3 or 4 years of your life, could be more, but it's years of your life. And for me, like I can only approach it if I believe that this is a relationship. If you're in a relationship with another human being for 3 years, like that's a pretty decent relationship. That's a big chunk of time. So I have to believe this is like a friendship or love affair, however you want to think about it, that I'm going to be really devoted to for years. Where I will wake up in the morning and it's all I want to do is spend time with this thing. Where I'll go to bed at night, it's what I want to dream about. And I have to really believe that sincerely, because if I don't, at some point it just gets too hard and I'll get really cynical and be phoning it in. So the interesting thing here was it was a movie and a story and characters that I cared about deeply, and even after we were done, we picture locked in July of 2014 and working on Sound and Music and premiered it at Sundance, but all that time that we were done, we believed in what we made, but we still had no idea. Like at that point it was like, wow, we cannot control at all how other people are going to receive this. Like what, with all the stuff that they will bring into it, their own assumptions about Wallace, their own relationships with Wallace or his writing, all of those things, you just can't control it. And so, I think Jason as an actor, I mean, he's joked about this, but he said, would an audience, in seeing him maybe together perform sort of like an amputated limb that's been reattached, would they just reject seeing Jason Segel do serious acting? All of those things. It's sort of how much can the audience let go of their own stuff and just embrace the movie. Of course, audiences do this all the time, but this is all I was thinking about for years. So it's the first time I've done that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We hope that you will come back in 2 years or next year next time you have a movie. And the movie opens here August 14th, so please make sure you tell everybody. And Heather, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about